question because, Mr. Speaker, a group supporting you, run by one of your closest longtime advisors, has put out a very scathing attack just today on Governor Romney on his tenure as the CEO of that investment firm, Bain Capital. It calls that tenure a story of greed. That's a quote, saying that Bain made spectacular profits by, again, quote, stripping American businesses of assets, selling everything to the highest bidder, and often killing jobs for big financial rewards. Do you agree with that characterization?
Well, I haven't seen the film, but it does reflect the New York Times story 2 days ago about one particular company. And I think people should look at the film and decide if it's factually accurate. It raises questions. I'm very much for free enterprise. I'm very much for exactly what the governor just described. Create a business, grow jobs, provide leadership. I'm not nearly as enamored of a Wall Street model where you can flip companies, you can go in and have leveraged buyouts, you can basically take out all the money, leaving behind the workers.
Is that the Bain model?
Well, I think you have to look at the film, and you have to look at the New York Times coverage of one particular company, and you have to ask yourself some questions. The governor has every right to defend that, but I think it's a legitimate part of the debate to say, okay, on balance, were people better off or were people worse off for this particular style of investment?
Back in December, you said that Governor Romney made money at Bain by, quote, bankrupting companies and laying off employees.
That was, I think, the New York Times story 2 days ago. They took one specific company, they walked through in detail, they showed what they bought it for, how much they took out of it, and the 1,700 people they left unemployed. Now, check the New York Times story, but that's their story.
Recently, Dr. Paul referred to you as a chicken hawk because you didn't serve. Given what you just heard Governor Perry say about understanding the military and Dr. Paul's comments, how do you respond?
Well, Dr. Paul makes a lot of comments. It's part of his style. My father served 27 years in the Army in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. I grew up in a military family moving around the world. Since 1979, I've spent 32 years working, starting with the Army's Training and Doctrine Command. I was the longest-serving teacher in the senior military for 23 years. I served in the Defense Policy Board. But let me say something about veterans, because as an Army brat whose family was deeply engaged, I feel for veterans. We had a great meeting today in Wolfboro with veterans, and I made a commitment in New Hampshire that we would reopen the hospital in Manchester. We would develop a new clinic in the North Country using telecommunications, and we would provide a system where veterans could go to their local doctor or their local hospital. The idea that a veteran in the North Country in midwinter has to go all the way to Boston is absolutely, totally, fundamentally wrong. And I would say, as an Army brat who watched his mother, his sisters, and his father for 27 years, I have a pretty good sense of what military families and veterans' families need. Dr. Paul has a long history of saying things that are inaccurate and false. The fact is, I never asked for deferment. I was married with a child. It was never a question. My father was, in fact, serving in Vietnam in the Mekong Delta at the time he's referring to. I think I have a pretty good idea of what it's like as a family to worry about your father getting killed, and I personally resent the kind of comments and aspersions he routinely makes without accurate information and then just slurs people with.
Given that you oppose gay marriage, what do you want gay people to do who want to form loving, committed, long-term relationships? What is your solution? And Speaker Gingrich?
Well, I think what I would say is that we want to make it possible to have those things that are most intimately human between friends occur. For example, you're in a hospital. If there are visitation hours, should you be allowed to stay there? There ought to be ways to designate that. You want to have somebody in your will. There ought to be ways to designate that. But it is a huge jump from being understanding and considerate and concerned, which we should be, to saying we're therefore going to institute the sacrament of marriage as though it has no basis. The sacrament of marriage was based on a man and woman, has been for 3,000 years, is at the core of our civilization, and is something worth protecting and upholding. And I think protecting and upholding that doesn't mean that you have to go out and make life miserable for others, but it does mean you make a distinction between a historic sacrament of enormous importance in our civilization and simply deciding it applies everywhere and it's just a civil right. It's not. It is a part of how we define ourselves, and I think that a marriage between a man and a woman is part of that definition. I just want to raise, since we spent this much time on these issues, I just want to raise a point about the news media bias. You don't hear the opposite question asked. Should the Catholic Church be forced to close its adoption services in Massachusetts because it won't accept gay couples, which is exactly what the state has done? Should the Catholic Church be driven out of providing charitable services in the District of Columbia because it won't give in to secular bigotry? Should the Catholic Church find itself discriminated against by the Obama administration on key delivery of services because of the bias and the bigotry of the administration? The bigotry question goes both ways, and there's a lot more anti-Christian bigotry today than there is concern on the other side, and none of it gets covered by the news media. Well, I think we're asking the wrong questions. Afghanistan is a tiny piece of a gigantic mess that is very dangerous. Pakistan is unstable, and they probably have between 100 and 200 nuclear weapons. Iran is actively trying to get nuclear weapons. I mean, they go out and practice closing the Straits of Hormuz, where 1 out of every 6 barrels of oil goes through every day. And if they close the Straits of Hormuz, you have an industrial depression across the planet within 48 hours. You have the Muslim Brotherhood winning the elections in Egypt. The truth is we don't know who's in charge in Libya. You have a region-wide crisis, which we have been mismanaging and underestimating, which is not primarily a military problem. We're not going to go in and solve Pakistan militarily. We're not going to go in and solve all these other things. Look at the rate at which Iraq is decaying. I mean, they began decaying within 24 hours of our last troops leaving. And I think we need a fundamentally new strategy for the region comparable to what we developed to fight the Cold War. And I think it's a very big, hard, long-term problem, but it's not primarily a military problem.
Speaker, do you agree send back troops into Iraq right now?
Well, no, but let me put it in context. I was very honored today to have Bud McFarland come to introduce me at our Veterans Rally. Bud was for 5 years Ronald Reagan's National Security Advisor, and I worked with him in the 80s on the strategy to defeat the Soviet Empire. Here's the key thing to remember. If you're worried about the Iranians in Iraq, develop a strategy to replace the Iranian dictatorship, and Iraq will be fine. If you want to stop Wahhabism, get an American energy policy so no American president ever again bows to a Saudi king, and then you can put pressure on the Saudis because you have enough American energy to stop them.
Speaker Gingrich, I know you agree with Governor Romney again on his views on President Obama, but how would your plans on job creation distinguish you from Governor Romney?
Well, if you're talking about infrastructure?
Infrastructure and more broadly job creation.
But let's stick with infrastructure things, because I think it's a very big, very important topic. You cannot compete with China in the long run if you have an inferior infrastructure. You've got to move to a 21st century model. That means you got to be technologically smart, and you have to make investments. So, for example, here, the Northern Pass project ought to be buried and should be along the state right-of-way, which means you'll use modern techniques to bring electricity from Quebec all the way down to Boston in a way that also preserves the beauty of northern New Hampshire. I would have an energy program designed to get us free from Saudi Arabia, Iran, Venezuela. 2/3 of the government revenue from that would go to debt reduction and to paying off the debt. 1/3 would go to infrastructure, which would give you the ability to have an infrastructure investment program that would actually get us back on track. And you look at places like the highways you're describing, the bridges the governor just described, if you don't have some systematic investment program, then you're not going to be able, I think, to compete with China and India.
You've made the case on several occasions that he's not the man to carry that message for the Republican Party. Why not?
Well, look, I think that's a good message, and I agree with him. A little bit harsh on President Obama, who I'm sure in his desperate efforts to create a radical European socialist model is sincere. But, you know, I think the Wall Street Journal captured it the other day in their dialogue when their editorial board met, and they said, I had a very aggressive pro-jobs program, 0 capital gains, 12.5% corporate tax rate, 100% expensing for all new equipment to dramatically modernize the system, abolish the death tax. And they said that by contrast, this is their words, not mine, that Governor Romney's program was timid and more like Obama. Now, I would think those are fighting words, and frankly, if he wants to fight with the Wall Street Journal on that, I wouldn't blame him. But I do think there's a difference between a bold Reagan conservative model and a more establishment model that is a little more cautious about taking the kind of changes we need.
We are 5 days away from fundamentally transforming the United States of America.
The American people create jobs, not government.
Would you reappoint Ben Bernanke?
I would fire him tomorrow. I think the Fed should be audited. I'm not particularly worried about Governor Perry and Governor Romney frightening the American people when President Obama scares them every single day. When I was Speaker, we added 11 million jobs in a bipartisan effort, including welfare reform, the largest capital gain tax cut in history. We balanced the budget for 4 straight years. How would the country feel today at 4.2% unemployment? That's my credential. I'm going to outline a 21st century contract with America. It's going to be far bolder, far deeper, far more profound than what we did in 1994 or what I helped Jack Kemp and Ronald Reagan do in 1980. I am very much in favor of school choice. My personal preference would be to have a Pell Grant for K through 12 so that every parent could pick with their child any school they wanted to send them to. I think unemployment compensation should be tied directly to a training program so that 99 weeks becomes an investment in human capital, giving us the best trained workforce in the world. But I believe it is fundamentally wrong to give people money for 99 weeks for doing nothing. The Congress this year, this next week, ought to repeal the Dodd-Frank bill. They ought to repeal the Sarbanes-Oxley bill. They ought to start creating jobs right now, because for those 14 million Americans, this is a depression now. Well, I'm frankly not interested in your effort to get Republicans fighting each other. I, for one, and I hope all of my friends up here, are going to repudiate every effort of the news media to get Republicans to fight each other to protect Barack Obama, who deserves to be defeated, and all of us are committed as a team. Whoever the nominee is, we are all for defeating Barack Obama. Nothing will turn America around more than election night when Barack Obama loses decisively.